So, imagine turning on your kitchen faucet and no water comes out, or it's contaminated water and you can't use it. So, we take clean drinking water, flood control, and sewage systems all for granted because they're all heavily funded by the federal government to survive. So, whether you live in a rural town or a big city, they all directly affect your daily life and they affect your health, they affect your personal safety, and they affect your monthly bills. So, over the past couple months, I've been working directly with one of my old professors. We've been analyzing decades of congressional data, more specifically, examining how partisan friction impacts federal water projects. So, by examining federal water infrastructure, we can see that political polarization increases Congress, our nation's long term investment in public resources shifts from steady, proactive planning to unpredictable, reactive spending. So, today I'll tell you about the predictability challenge of stop and go budget cycles, the balance between proactive modernization and reactive disaster relief, and how natural disasters create a crisis override that briefly stops bipartisan action. So, first, let's talk about how partisan gridlock creates a predictability challenge um, for federal water systems. So, political polarization in the federal government has reached historical heights, creating a stop and go budget cycle that disrupts routine water projects. So, public goods like water facilities require multiple years of planning and steady cash flow. However, as political parties drift further apart in their ideologies, lawmakers passing regular, predictable bills for um, force federal water agencies to delay repairs and face massive project backlogs. And according to political scientists Nolan McCarty, Keith Poole, and Howard Rosenthal, in their 2006 study on American polarization, Congress has grown drastically more ideologically divided over the last few decades based on roll call data. And then, according to Sarah Binder, a leading legislative scholar, has written for the American Political Science Review, there is a direct link between partisan gridlock and legislative paralysis, making steady routine funding incredibly difficult to secure. So now that I've told you about how gridlock creates a predictability challenge, let's look about how polarization moves federal government spending from proactive maintenance to reactive natural disaster relief. So, polarization actively prevents the government from maintaining systems, forcing federal dollars to be spent on emergencies rather than prevention. Modernizing water systems before they break is by far cheaper and safer than fixing major collapse. However, partisan gridlock incentivizes and ignores politicians to ignore routine maintenance and wait until a crisis hits, since voters actively reward emergency aid. And according to Susan Mettler, a scholar from Cornell University, she says polarization actively erodes policy maintenance, which means that our government stops looking after long term systems we already built and letting them quietly disappear. And then also, researchers Andrew Healy and Neil Malhorta, in their study in 2009, they said political systems heavily incentivizes disaster response over prevention, revealing that voters consistently reward politicians for handing out emergency relief money after disaster, but fail to reward them for spending money on prevention that would have stopped the disaster. So, after seeing how polarization favors emergency response over prevention, let's explore what happens when an extreme event actually occurs. So, extreme weather events and severe droughts can temporarily cut through gridlock to kind of bring about bipartisan water infrastructure legislation. So, while polarization usually stops cooperation, massive natural disasters make politicians everywhere in the federal government temporarily align their goals because managing water infrastructure requires deep intergovernmental coordination. However, relying on severe disasters to trigger funding is unstable and dangerous way to manage a nation's water supply. And then, according to researchers Andrea Gerlach and Tanya Haikila, in their study on U.S. water governance, managing drinking water and flood control requires deep, sustained coordination across local, state, and federal lines, something that partisan fighting directly disrupts. So, to revisit, by examining federal water infrastructure, we have seen how political polarization destabilizes our public goods, shifting funding from proactive, long-term planning to unpredictable, emergency-driven spending. So we first explored predictability challenge by congressional gridlock. Then we examined how politicians would rather favor reactive disaster relief over proactive maintenance. And then finally, we saw how major natural disaster crises briefly override partisan divides to force action. So, overall, clean water is not a partisan issue, it is a human necessity. So, until our political institutions prioritize routine maintenance over partisan fighting, our physical infrastructures will continue to quietly degrade beneath our feet.